Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Luciana Gama Muniz. I am Project Director at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, CEBRI. It is a pleasure to be here today to have a discussion about economic policy and green recovery in Latin America post-COVID. The debate today is a partnership with Columbia Global Centers in Rio de Janeiro. And on behalf of CEBRI, I would like to give a special thanks to Thomas Trebat for inviting us to this initiative together. Thomas will introduce us to today's theme and also our two very special guests. I'll be back later for the Q&A. Please, Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luciana. Muito obrigado e boa noite para todos. Prazer estar com vocês. So it's my pleasant duty to introduce the theme of tonight's webinar, tonight's live session, which is nothing less important than the economic recovery of Latin America and the region seeks to avoid another lost decade. We have two wonderful speakers, José Antonio Ocampo and Rogério Studart. I'll introduce them a little bit more later on. I just wanted to set the stage a little bit. Although it's probably not necessary to do very much detail, but we are meeting tonight and living through really one of the most alarming periods in the recent history of Latin America, probably the worst economic downturn since the 1930s. There have been very severe disruptions to trade and financial flows throughout the region. And both the IMF and the World Bank have produced the most dire of economic forecasts for the region, at least for 2020. GDP for the region as a whole, the Latin American region, expected to be down at least 5%, maybe 6%, maybe even more. The pandemic, as you know, is an equal opportunity pandemic. It has hit every country in Latin America very, very hard. Those countries which took strong preventive measures like Chile and especially Peru have seen cases and death surge. Others, Brazil and Mexico among them, suffered from the very beginning, but probably proportionally just as much as the countries that did take measures. Unemployment is surging in the region. It's held back a little bit by emergency expenditures for the unemployed. In Brazil, they call it auxílio emergencial, but it is surging. Poverty and extreme poverty are bound to rise. We don't need the CEPAL to tell us that, but CEPAL tells us that they expect 30 million people to fall into the category below poverty lines in the different Latin American countries. Alarmingly, a lot of organizational capital is being lost. Many businesses that are now shuttered, we see them on the street every day, will not return, and perhaps especially in the employment-intensive service sectors of the large cities of Latin America. So employment, unemployment, getting growth going again is at the forefront of the policy agenda. And these economies, in retrospect, are already battered, have already had several years of slow growth and are experiencing outbreaks of political turmoil. So this is a very disruptive scenario, to say the least. And there's no hope, there's no help necessarily on the way from the world economy in terms of capital flows or commodity prices or pickup in global trade. Neither the World Bank nor the IMF believes there will be a significant world economy in the foreseeable future. So this is our task here tonight, is to begin to assess the damage, but more importantly, to figure out where to go next and how to do it. We need to think about a model of growth for Latin America that combines both efficiency and equity, growth and equality of opportunity, both at the same time. And that vision of a Latin American model of economic growth, efficiency and equity, growth and distribution, it can seem very far away at times. And so we kind of wonder whether or not we'll ever see it, especially in these darkest of days. Well, the two great persons we have tonight in conversation with us, and I thank them again, are not, don't want to be called optimists, but they are very experienced practitioners, researchers, and policymakers looking at Latin America and the Brazilian economy including the Brazilian economy in detail for a long period of time, and have ideas of what we should do next. How do we exit this so-called valley of despair? Jose Antonio Ocampo, proud to call my good friend, is one of the world's most prominent development economists with a global reputation in many areas, but especially, I would say, in the area of social policy and its links to growth. He's now back at Columbia University after yet another stint in his native Colombia, in Bogota, as a senior member of the Central Bank of Colombia. He's held enough senior positions that would be a full resume for anybody else, but he has managed to be both the executive secretary of CEPAL, based in Santiago, and head of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs in New York. So he's had a lot of vantage points to look at our Latin American region. We're happy to have him back at Columbia University and to welcome to this call. He'll be followed tonight after a 10 to 15 minute opening comments by Rogério Studart, known very well, of course, CEBRI Senior Fellow and one of Brazil's most experienced and outspoken economic experts with a vast experience in the most important development institution of our times, the World Bank, the IDB, and various UN agencies. Rogério is now based in Washington, is dedicated to issues of climate change, sustainability at the World Resources Institute in Washington, where he is leading the way through his publications and through his example for a new generation of scholars in this field of climate studies and climate policy. So here's the format, as Luciana has already hinted to. Each will make opening comments of 10 to 15 minutes. Then we'll try to moderate debate between the two for another 20 to 25 minutes following that. And then Luciana will come back in and curate your questions and answers. So it's a very important debate at an important time with very, very good speakers. So it's my pleasure to turn the screen over to the first of these, Jose Antonio Ocampo. Welcome, Jose Antonio.
Well, thank you very much to Luciana and Tom for this introduction and for the invitation to this joint event between CEBRI and the Columbia University Center in Rio de Janeiro. Let me, well, and very nice to be in the panel with Rogério, with whom we have actually a long relation from the days I was secretary of CEPAL, but he was one of the brilliant researchers of CEPAL at the time. So you know, I have had a very extensive relations with him through time. Let me start by underscoring some of the Thomas' comments, and then go into the agenda that a group of about a bit more than 30 academics and former public officials launched, as called the Latin American Consensus 2020, which is an agenda, let's say, for structural reforms of Latin America in the way of, in a way which is different from the concept of structural reforms that was used back in the 1980s and 1990s, let's say. So let me perhaps point out that, of course, this is, as he pointed out, this is the worst pandemics in a century, and the worst world economic crisis in 9 decades, since the Great Depression of the 1930s. How long it will be, hopefully it will be less than the Great Depression, which lasted 10 years in the United States. But there are lots of uncertainties about the speed of recovery, particularly because of the second waves of pandemics that we are starting to see, notably in Europe. And actually also partly in the United States, actually. And now, and possibly it could happen in, or is expected in other Latin American countries. Now, Latin America of course, became the epicenter of the pandemics 3 months ago. Now India seems to be replacing Latin America, but still it's a major problem. Actually, in the developing world, by far the worst case of Latin America. And very interestingly, the pandemics have been shared by countries that have not done much to control it, like Brazil, with countries that have done quite a bit to control it, like my country, Colombia, for example, or Argentina, which is now being hit, relatively hard. Anyway, so it's a very, although there are diverse ways of handling it, the effect has been quite severe. And it has been quite severe because of the mix of, let's say, of supply effects, activities that are shut down almost totally, like tourism or passenger air traffic, let's say, to activities, particularly in services, in urban services, which are significantly constrained. With the effects of demand, because people are without jobs, and the poor households in particular have severe problems in terms of income, basically because of the importance of informal jobs and informal sources of income that are not coming. Now, so the shock has been severe. I mean, Latin America, according to the IMF and CEPAL, which are the latest projections, is expected to fall more than 9%. It's only second to Western Europe in terms of the effects on the pandemic. But beyond the pandemics, there is a point that I have made very strongly, which is the fact that this crisis, this very deep crisis, follows 5 years of very poor economic performance in Latin America. I mean, the period 2014, 2019 was a period in which Latin America almost did not grow. Or if you exclude Venezuela, it grew less than 1% per year. Some countries very hardly hit, including Brazil, including Mexico, I mean, the two largest economies of the region, including Argentina and several other countries. So this is a period that actually, when I wrote an op-ed at the end of last year, I called the lost half decade. The lost half decade. But now the effect of that is that because of the crisis, that will turn into a full lost decade. 2015, 2014 is going to be a lost decade, even worse in a sense than the lost decade of the 1980s in terms of economic growth. And let me say that the social conditions have worsened significantly. Actually, there has been a very important improvement in social indicators from in Latin America from, let's say, 2002, 2003 to 2014. Actually, one of the strongest decline of poverty in the history of Latin America, which was in part due to improvements in income distribution, which is a very strange phenomenon by Latin American history. And those improvements had already stopped and actually started to reverse themselves during this lost half decade of 2015, 2019. And now they're going to experience a terrible shock this year, or they are experiencing a terrible shock this year. I mean, according to CEPAL, for example, the number of poor will increase by 45 million people. It's a reversal of 50 years. 50 years of reversal in terms of poverty reduction in Latin America. It's a terrible situation, by far. It is in this context that this group of the mix of academics and former officials, or both of them, like my case, which has been both academic and a public sector official, we launched this idea of a Latin American Consensus 2020. Now, the Latin American Consensus 2020 has 18 specific recommendations It's of course an open agenda for countries to adopt it at the national level. Let me say that that it has 5 big issues in the agenda. 1 second.
Professor Ocampo?
Jose Antonio? You have to
Oh,
unmute.
he's back.
Yeah, I am back. Sorry, I had a little inconvenience here. So the 5 issues in the agenda are, first of all, a big push in social development. A big push that should aim actually at restoring the improvements in income distribution in the region. That has some challenges that can be that we can build upon the current crisis and actually the previous history. For example, the basic income for poor households, a policy in which Brazil has already a long experience, but many other countries do. But I would say the most important of all by far is the recovery of employment. Because of the huge shock on employment and particularly on formal employment during the current crisis. So what specific policies are going to be adopted to improve employment is going to be critical in all countries. The second issue is actually to rethink the role of let's say of production sector policies. You say industrial policies, but it's not only manufacturing. It can be natural resource sectors. It can be very important in today's service sectors that will become a big push in terms of development. So it's a return to the idea that aside from the macroeconomics, let's say we have to rethink seriously about pushing up specific sectors with a very important focus on science and technology development. So with a big improvement in research and development and the innovations that are associated to them. Okay, so that's by the way, Latin America invests in research and development like 0.6% of GDP. This is 1/4 of what China does. And let's say it's about 1/8 of what Korea does. So it's a really limited effort by Latin America. Brazil is a bit better than the average, but it's the only one that has invested more than 1% of GDP. Okay, and it's still about half the level of China. The third issue is actually, is to continue with the, stable macroeconomics, which is one of the good legacies, let's say, of the recent or the market reform period, but with a stronger focus on avoiding crisis. Because one characteristic of Latin America over the last 3 decades is that we are too vulnerable to crisis. And that's a particular issue. So what can be done in terms of fiscal policies or monetary policies in order to avoid a crisis is a particularly important. I will add to that probably a lot of emphasis on fiscal revenues, which is going to be a critical issue during the recovery because of the huge increase in debt ratios that are taking place during the current crisis. The fourth issue is full respect for international agreements, which in our agenda basically has 2 topics. One, the topic that Rogério is going to underscore more, which is the agenda of the international environmental agreements, climate change and biodiversity in particular. The big push for the Sustainable Development Goals, the main international agenda set by the United Nations, and very importantly, the renewal of dynamic regional integration processes, which are going to be particularly important because international trade is not going to be very dynamic going forward. It actually has not been very dynamic over the last decade. The growth of international trade has been about 3% per year in volume since the 2008 crisis, and it may be less than that going forward. So, the renewal of regional integration processes is going to be particularly critical for the dynamism of international trade, which, in my view, or in our view, actually requires the depoliticization of regional integration agreements. Regional integration in Europe is integration among states, not of governments. In Latin America, we became used to this issue that governments say, I enter or leave integration agreements. No, it's a commitment of states. It's a permanent commitment of countries and not of individual governments. And I think this is something that is very important to really consolidate a strong regional integration agreements in Latin America. And last but not least is a strong renewal of democratic forces, which is a very, very important issue. Latin America, during the debt crisis of the 1980s, had one big surprise for the world. It became the region of the developing world with more democratic regimes. Lots of military regimes fell down during our, gave way to democratic governments in the 1980s, actually starting with 1979 in Ecuador and then going forward to lots of Latin American countries that had demilitarized regimes. And I think the renewal of democratic forces and the strengthening of democratic forces and full participation of citizens has to be another crucial element in this agenda. With this, let me give the floor then to Rogério. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just take a quick second just to let you catch your breath, and thank you very, very much, Jose Antonio. I'll love to come back to you in the following Rogério's remarks about some of the issues, so maybe those about employment and labor market policies, which tend not to rank very high in countries such as Brazil, where the emphasis is on sustainable fiscal policies, and labor market policies, which are also important to fiscal stability, tend to get less mention. And I'd like maybe to ask you in the Q&A a little later on about the need for more active labor market policies in Latin America and whether that can help. And then your emphasis on regional integration. I think that's a long-held Latin American ideal. It has stayed at the government level, but maybe in this era, this COVID era, this post-pandemic era, it makes more sense to trade with those who are closest to you. Although you've put up a few red flags about political opposition to regional integration. And we here in this part of the world, we look at Brazil and Argentina right now as being poles apart politically. So the difficulties of regional integration, I'm sure you're more aware than anybody, but might be worth a little further look when we come back to you. But with that, Rogério, we've want to turn it over to you and welcome you with your remarks, which you've done a very interesting new study on how Brazil can sort of address some of these issues that Jose Antonio has mentioned, some of the challenges, in particular research and development while transitioning to a low carbon, uma economia de baixo carbono. So please, Rogério, welcome to the webinar, and the screen is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you, CEBRI and the Columbia Rio de Janeiro Center for what is truly an honor and a pleasure it is to be invited for this seminar, particularly to have Jose Antonio and the panel, and Thomas, two economists that in different parts of my life have shaped the way I see economics and development. I want to thank Luciana for intermediating, and Eduardo for the support. And I want to start, I decided to focus, Jose Antonio always makes things easier and more difficult for me when we talk. He covered significant part of what I want to say, but it's difficult to follow such an incredible presentation. So I'm going to focus on the issue of green recovery, particularly why and how for Latin America. And I first want to start by defining what I'm talking about. I see when I talk about green recovery, I'm talking about recovering by making transformational investments, particularly infrastructure, agriculture, industry, that lead to more productive, innovative, competitive, inclusive recovery that also creates a path for future development. So what I want to indicate, I want to convince you is that for Latin America and for the region, a green recovery is not only the right thing to do, but is an incredible opportunity. And you have mentioned the study that came out from WRI. By the way, my opinions here are personal, but I'm completely dedicated to the conclusions of the study that you mentioned for Brazil, show that there are enormous opportunities in terms of growth and employment. And just for Brazil, the study concludes that you could have more $500 billion of GDP by 2030, 2 million jobs by 2030 if you chose this path, if you put sustainability as the axis of development and recovery. So this is how I define recovery. And let me tell you the plan. The first part of the plan, Jose Antonio has covered, which is to talk about why Latin America was hit so badly by this crisis. And it has to do with the fact that it was already fragile, both on the economic front and on the social front. On the social front, inequality, significant inequality. On an economic front, I would put that in relation to the low levels of investment that have permeated the region for many decades, particularly in infrastructure and logistics. And I want to talk about that and what are the consequences for what I'm analyzing here. I confirm, I mean, this is a humanitarian tragedy. The four of the countries with the highest deaths per million in the world coming from COVID are in the region: Peru, Bolivia, Brazil, and Chile. 6 out of 10 are in the region if we include Mexico and Ecuador. And it is important to say from the start that there is a lot of socioeconomic diversity in the region. It's difficult to talk about one country, about Brazil or Colombia and Nicaragua, and the same, that different issues. But in general, the crisis has been extremely painful in a humanitarian way, and the economic consequences are just evolving. So we were in a trajectory that was not good. The economy was hit in a very fragile way, in a moment of high fragility. And the question is, how do we proceed from there? I don't want to make the case that the green recovery is just beneficial. I mean, anybody that has children or grandchildren would say that it's a more imperative to preserve the environment. What I want to stress is that it creates benefits and opportunities that can be grabbed right away, and Latin America has significant advantages in doing so, and that also will facilitate to overcome some of the problems. I don't want to talk about the issue of inequality, but it's one issue that we have to address, and we have to address in the recovery. And let me talk right away about the measures that you have to entertain in order to address the current crisis. The first one, there's 3 phases at least. The first one, an emergency, preserving lives and livelihoods. This is being done more or less well, but in Latin America, with the caveat that you have, as Jose Antonio mentioned, a very poor social safety net and capacity to provide the public goods in health, in sanitation needed for that. The second one is the recovery. How do you recover the 40 million jobs that you have lost in the process? We still have to address that. And how do we take back 45 million people that went to extreme poverty? And then you have the third thing, you have to think about building better. I'm not even talking about rebuilding, which for the Latin American context is different from the one in industrial countries, because they're discussing how to better allocate the investments that they are already planning and making them green. In Latin America, it's finding the resources, deciding where to go, and making the investments. And that's where the Latin American has a comparative advantage and has more to gain for choosing a green recovery. Green recovery, I want to stress, is not a dream, but it's not just a dream, it's a huge opportunity. Latin America has missed many opportunities, and I think that this one, for the sake of the next generations, we cannot miss. Why does the region have comparative advantage in green in a green recovery? First of all, I don't have to stress that it's a biogiant. I mean, it's over 30% of the world's species and biomas. 3 of the top countries have the most quantities of birds, amphibians, and so on. 40% of its land is covered by forest. It's a biogiant. The region's a biogiant. If for that reason, it has to be more careful in preserve this wealth, but also what I would call the natural capital. Why? I don't want to make it complicated, but just think about this. The rainforests, and this is well established, produce something that Carlos Nobre once described as a flying river. That flying river provides the water and this for the whole region, all the way to the Patagonia, and the ingredients to make agriculture, for instance, thrive. I mean, this is just one example why the biomas that we have in the region are such important natural capital, and that have to be preserved. It's good economics to preserve them, because otherwise you're killing your future too. The second thing is that the region is already being affected by climate change and by extreme weather events. If we want to make investments, we have to accommodate for that. Otherwise, you are going to end up with assets that are stranded assets, or you're going to end up with infrastructure and productive sectors that will not be able to function in a situation of climate change because of droughts, fires, rising sea levels. So you have to make investments now that are at the same time produce the jobs that you want to produce the growth that you want to produce, and puts the region in a path of that is at the same time more productive, more competitive, more inclusive, but also resilient to climate change. And when it comes to that, clearly I've been studying more the issue of how to mobilize resources for sustainable infrastructure, which is any infrastructure that is at the same time reduces carbon emission and is more resilient to climate change. And I think that advantage of doing that for the region are fantastic. First of all, the multipliers of infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, are the same as any other infrastructure, and they're very high, production and jobs. Second, the resilience can be increased quite substantially by introducing sustainable infrastructure. Third, by bringing sustainable infrastructure to become a priority, you create an innovation drive that is being missing. José Antonio mentioned that. Any long-term development requires countries and regions to have some innovation drive. I think we have to invest in artificial intelligence, but for sure, we don't have the competitive advantage anymore to catch up on some of them. But we have a lot to give and to produce if we put sustainability as an axis of investments and policies. Because we have the advantage that I mentioned, but we have the knowledge and the capacity in the region to use the diversity and the natural capital in favor of innovative ways of addressing that. Now, finally, this is a point for me, as you mentioned, Thomas, I'm a macroeconomist specialized in finance, and I've been always writing about resource mobilization. And that's what makes me even more excited about this possibility, because by bringing sustainability as the axis of future development in the region, you have much more capacity nowadays to mobilize resources. And why do I say that? I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible in the next 4 minutes that I have. It's quite simple. There's a structural change in the financial sector, which is going to change the supply of loanable funds to the region of elsewhere. It's happening right now, which is by mainstreaming climate risk in the allocation of portfolio of major institutional investors and so on. I mean, you have a consequence, a diversification of that portfolio that is driving green finance to increase exponentially. And this is being concentrated in Europe and in Asia and even in the United States, simply because you have more projects, more sustainable projects that you can package and use to back the issuance of credit and green securities. Now, the region has the capacity, doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, but has to realign, the existing instruments and the existing capabilities to produce those these pipelines of sustainable projects, and then create the bridges internationally and nationally to bring that capital to complement the public resources that are limited by the different reasons that we can discuss. So what I'm saying is that if you send a very clear signal, if the leadership, both public and private leadership, send a very clear signal that the region is open for sustainable business, and you align your policy from the central bank, for instance, the Central Bank of Brazil now, and in Colombia is thinking of the same thing, and José Antonio knows that, is introducing climate risk as part of its regulations. But if you do that from the central bank to its public banks, to its private banks, and also put together a very simple architecture using the national development banks to generate the pipelines of projects, you can mobilize resources like no other region, I would claim, would be able to do that. So for that reason, I think that my take and I want to conclude here, is that if you want future development to be based on innovation, on infrastructure and logistics that is needed for the productivity and competitiveness of the region, and based on mobilizing resources, there is no other way, there's no better opportunity for the region than to start thinking about a green recovery, but also a sustainable development program for the future. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rogério. A lot to think about and absorb. And if you don't mind, maybe I'll open this first part of our discussion. And by the way, we're going to rely on your questions, those of you listening to us on Facebook or via Zoom. We're going to rely on you to put your questions in the Q&A section so that we can take full advantage of the resources, the two resources we have speaking with us tonight. But I'd like, Rogério, you know this better than anybody, but the talk, and José Antonio, you mentioned this as well, that the need for private funding of infrastructure projects, that takes on different complexities across the Latin American region. José Antonio, it could be in your area of the world, the Spanish-speaking part, I should say, of Latin America, it could be political instability or recent histories of debt distress, such as in Argentina, the political turmoil in Bolivia, and of course the catastrophic political disaster that is Venezuela today. So I'm raising an issue about how realistic it is for Latin America to look on foreign finance, but particularly, Rogério, and I'll start with you. This issue of green financing, I think it's terrific. I think you're onto something very important. But if you noticed last night in that kind of inchoate debate in the United States, I'm sure many of you tuned in at least briefly, the only mention of Brazil was one by candidate Biden, but it reflects a very common stream of thinking in the international investment circles, that unless Brazil stops the desmatamento, deforestation in the Amazon biome in particular, it can't count on significant international resources. And international investors, Rogério, are echoing that. So how, if we can stick on that point, how are those of us in Brazil who need foreign funding, who believe in what you want to do, know that it's available, but how do we get, how serious should we take this movement, let's call it that, to withhold funding from countries like Brazil, which don't adhere to clean energy and proper land use strategies?
Well, first of all, I think that a country like Brazil can mobilize resources, and most of the resources needed will come domestically. I mean, it's not because, domestically. I mean, this is how large countries, continental countries do it. So I think I think it is a misunderstanding to think that external saving is what is going to solve the problem. However, what I have to say is this: do we have to take it very seriously? Yes, very, very serious. Why? Because it's not just the United States. You know, international investors and Brazilian investors and bankers are saying the same thing. I mean, the risks of deforestation and sending a signal of environmental degradations are too significant. It's not just because they care about it, and a lot of leaders in the financial sector care about it, because they create risks for their investment. I mean, I think that one thing is when people say, well, this is the right thing to do, and people should say always seek for the right thing to do. But when it becomes part of the economic logic, then things change a little bit. It can change for the negatives, to a negative way, or in a positive way. In a negative way is what we're observing now. I mean, international investors are saying they're not going to lend money in countries that destroy the environment, and also international direct investors, people that want to make the investments directly, are saying it's too risky for us. We don't want to mess with that because we know with climate change and with these policies, the risks are too significant for us. The positive way, if you say, no, we're going to preserve our natural capital. We're going to use our natural capital in a way that favors the region, but at the same time that attracts you, then you can benefit from that. It's a decision that the country has to take, and also provides a long-term vision for the region. The region has lost a long-term vision of where it wants to go. At the time, there was a significant bet on opening up trade and doing reforms. I don't want to question that. But what I'm saying is that clearly the world is not anymore sustaining that kind of hypothesis. So you have to think out of the box. What is out of the box right in front of your face? Send a message that you want to do to be more sustainable, and say, we are open to business for those who want to build a more sustainable, inclusive, productive, competitive region. And this is how we can gain from that.
Thank you so much, Rogério. José Antonio, I want to bring you in on this point first. I will then turn to you on another issue, José Antonio. But first, I wonder if you could pick up on this point of a green financing. It seems by definition, the concept of what did you call it? The floating river, right? Rogério, the Amazon biome, it affects climate conditions all over Latin America. But I wanted your thoughts about regional integration. This agenda of Rogério seems to me it only works if it's regional. Can't have significant solar development in one country, but not in others. Costs and research can be shared. Markets can be enlarged for these huge energy investments. It seems to make, well, I won't say only makes sense, but it only makes the most sense if it's regional. Is this sort of an agenda for green infrastructure part of your thinking on the new consensus for Latin America? Is it a way on a very practical level to bring countries that don't talk to each other very much and don't see much in common? Is this a way, green financing, new and building back better, is that a way to bring this region more closely together?
Let me perhaps endorse many of the ideas that Rogério has presented. I think a green growth is actually an opportunity, an opportunity for growth and employment generation. It's also very important from the point of view of innovation. So it can be a source of innovation and therefore coincides with the idea of innovation that I presented. And very important is also crucial from the macroeconomic and financial perspective. Actually, I don't know if Rogério knows this, but when I was in the board of the Central Bank of Colombia last year, I promoted the Colombian Central Bank to become part of the network of central banks working on macroeconomic and financial issues, which is coordinated by the Banque de France, but also with a lot of collaboration from the Bank of England and the Netherlands. Anyway, so it's so we were the second central bank of Latin America after Mexico that joined this network, and it recognizes that climate change can be a risk, a major risk. Now, answering Thomas' question, I think first of all, it is true that in many cases has to be a regional agenda. I mean, notably the Amazon has to be a regional agenda. After the confrontations and the policies announced by President Bolsonaro and the strong negative reaction of France on the Amazon, actually there was a meeting of the heads of state in Leticia, Colombia, to try to launch an Amazon agenda, which showed that there are several Amazon countries in South America that are deeply have to be deeply interested in this issue. By the way, it's also associated to another specific point, is that the major contribution of Latin America to climate change is deforestation. So if we don't stop deforestation, that has to be, in a sense, the first step. It's also crucial for the other point that Rogério mentioned, which is water. The availability of water, which is one of the great assets of South America in particular, and which has, of course, to be important for many other areas, for the opportunity that he mentioned of this green agenda. So it has to. In other cases, is less so. Let's say, for example, but not. For example, Colombia has this jungle in the Pacific, which actually continues into Panama. That has also, it's actually one of the most diverse jungles in the world. So that, for example, that's also a joint project with but let me also mention one last point, which I find important in terms of the regional agenda, which is to do more what the Europeans do, which is joint research and development.
Yeah.
So this, I mean, the Amazon and how to manage the Amazon, but also the broader agenda, for example, on green development, it should certainly be the source of a joint research and development, and there can be significant contribution from many countries that have research capacities and could be part of this increase in research and development that I mentioned in my presentation.
Thank you very, very much, José. There's a lot of ways I'd like to continue that, including your comments, maybe later on, not now, a quick word from you on politics and political disintegration in other areas, what to do about Venezuela, an important Amazon country, how worried should we be about what's happening in Bolivia, these sorts of questions. But maybe I'll put that aside for a minute, because I wanted to, before we run out of time, I really wanted to get back to the issue of employment. And it's in your, I think the first 3 points in your new consensus mention it explicitly. And everybody, there's nothing to disagree with, that we want a high employment economy. And Rogério talks about green finance from a jobs perspective. But correct me if I'm wrong, José Antonio, but for all you've written and all the work in social welfare economics that's been produced and all the comparative studies of Latin America with Europe, the importance of labor market institutions helping people find jobs when they're unemployed, supporting them and getting back into the workforce, the importance of labor unions, employer associations, harmonious resolution of labor disputes, that doesn't seem, am I wrong, but it doesn't seem to be getting, never gets the attention it deserves. Instead, the attention here in Brazil, just to give you an example, is we have to reduce pensions. Well, that's a labor market that supports the demand in the economy, or we have to make more flexible the common labor law legislation here in Brazil. That's perceived as harming or making life riskier for workers. So I just wanted your opinion. Am I right that labor markets that don't get the attention from policy that they deserve? And what would you do, or what would you recommend to countries like Brazil with high rates of employment for the foreseeable future, disastrously high rates of employment for the foreseeable future? What should we be doing that they're not doing?
Let me start by saying that the contrast to Europe during this crisis in labor is the United States. I mean, the collapse of labor markets of employment in the US was dramatic compared to the very active policies that Europeans have taken to protect jobs. Anyway, that's Anyway, but in the case of Latin America, I think, well, the specific issue of pensions is a major agenda. It's certainly a major agenda for Brazil because of the very large fiscal expenses associated to the pension system of Brazil. But you know, taking those issues aside, I think that there are two major questions. The first is structural, and the second is conjunctural. You know, what to do in the recovery. So on the structural part, I think you know, aside from having I mean, incorporating fully the let's say the decent job agenda of the International Labor Organization has to be a major topic, which it means social protection, it means protection of labor unions, you know, and basic and access to basic you know, social protection systems, which is you know, a very, very important issue. And in the case of Latin America, very, very importantly, is the issue of labor market informality, how to formalize the labor market, so as to see how independent workers and workers in the small enterprises are equally protected by these standards of access to social protection, and very importantly also, which you also mentioned, is the capacity to retrain constantly, which has been a great success in some European countries. I mean, Denmark being always mentioned as the best case of a country that is capable of recirculating workers, you know, and making them responsive to structural change, which, by the way, is going to be very crucial because of the crisis, because the development of ICT and the expansion of ICT technologies in all sectors is one of the legacies of this crisis. And how to manage that in terms of training of workers is going to be very critical. But aside from that, there is the issue of recovery. You know, how do we generate lots of employment during the recovery?
Yes.
And in my way of presenting this, it has to be a mix. Well, first of all, of promoting labor-intensive sectors. Rogério mentioned actually the green economy is part of that. I think is capable of having a very strong employment generation. But aside from that, I have been proposing, for example, for Colombia, two types of policies. First of all, an explicit subsidy to small firms that they generate employment. So the subsidy per worker per new worker that is higher, which actually can be done together with financing by the development banks. For example, you give a credit, and then part of the benefit, if they generate employment, is that the credit is partly written off. Okay, so the subsidy given through credit, let's say, that's one particular alternative. So it's subsidized working, and then have an emergency program for employment. You know, so a lot of specific projects in the past. Latin America did that in different countries. You know, I mean, the most remarkable case, of course, is Chile in the 1980s. Yes. By the you know, having lots of employment programs, which actually have to first of all have to aim at the sector that have been most strongly affected by the crisis, the workers that are most strongly affected by the crisis, which are women and young people. So have to be. That's why. You know, not necessarily infrastructure projects are a solution, because they basically employ men. So this is more focused on that, which actually can include lots of the projects that protection of environmental protection that are consistent with the agenda that Rogério mentioned. For example, the protection of water sources. I mean, for example, reforestation. Of where the water sources are, or actually environmental cleaning up, etc. And those are lots of specific projects that can include some of the green economy projects that Rogério mentioned.
Thank you very much. I'm probably one of the few people on the call, Jose Antonio, who actually remembers that Chilean labor market policy of the 1980s. That was implemented during the height of, or just beyond the height of neoliberal fervor in Chile. So it wasn't like a socialist government by any means, quite the contrary. And it was quite effective at a critical point in the recovery of the Chilean economy by working on the demand side, by giving workers some degree of insurance against permanent unemployment, and giving the economy time to recover on a more structural basis. So I think those kinds of emergency employment programs, your previous work is on this, Jose Antonio, is really worth visiting. I probably don't have time, Luciana, to go into one more topic, but I'm going to do it anyway, and then ask if Jose Antonio and Rogério can deal with a large topic somewhat synthetically. Hopefully I can be synthetic in my question to them. It's on technology, Rogério, so critical to what you're thinking. And I read your document and couldn't help but be enthusiastic about the possibilities of green technology, including the whole range of different sources of energy here in Brazil. But I'm wondering, how remote is that technology from the region? And Jose Antonio, without necessarily talking only about the green economy, I'd like your comments too on technology. Where is the region technologically? Because this has been a goal for the economic development of Latin America for 75 or 80 years. And yet the common sense we have, and maybe this is wrong, is that the region is not very advanced technologically, and we're very, very far away from Industria 4.0, Industria 4.0. But if we could go maybe just quickly to each of you on this critical issue of the region's ability to create and or absorb technologies, how would you rate it, and what needs to be done? Rogério?
Well, let me very quickly try to address that, but I want to make one mention. I mean, there was a IDB, Inter-American Development Bank study now, that came out with some of the employment could be created by green investments. And we're not just talking about reforestation, that could be done, which is very intensive. We're talking about nature-based solutions. We're talking about urban mobility. We're talking about sustainable sanitation using natural infrastructure. We're talking about renewable energy. Now, so there's a range of things that are right in front of that, from cleaning the rivers to cleaning the mangroves to producing the state-of-art renewable energy and renewable and carbon-free urban mobility of the 21st century. So there are a lot of things involved in that. Now that goes to your question. We are very far from some technological frontiers. You mentioned some of them, but there are some of them that are going to become critical for the next decade that we have right in front of us. Just take, for instance, when you can fly, just go to Porto Alegre and you're going to see a marvel in terms of urban mobility, the most efficient train using mobile mobility, which is, I can't forget the name, I can't remember the name, but it's right outside the airport. You take it, it's a very sophisticated systems out there. You take the company called Sunu that produce solar panels that are flexible in Brazil. You take in Colombia, I know several examples, but I don't want to take that from Jose Antonio. There in Chile, you have several examples of the frontier technology that you could expand. And those are going to be the technologies that are going to be high in demand. It's not going to be just artificial intelligence. It's going to be how to promote the changes necessary using technology, nature-based solutions in locus, in investments. And this is where Latin America should and could go. And that has so many benefits that I find it amazing that they are not being explored as they could be.
Thank you very much, Jose. Any comments from you, Jose, before we turn it over to the questions?
Let me say that in some areas, some of the innovations are technological, but some of the innovations are administrative. For example, the the transportation systems and how you organize them. I mean, it's largely an administrative issue in terms of by the city government, let's say. So there can be many solutions, and some of them are actually labor intensive and don't require lots of major technology. I mean, how you protect rivers, how you reforest, how you protect the water resources. Those are not major technological innovations. Now, in technological innovations, in some areas, we are not that bad by world standards. I mean, certainly for example, Brazil is one of the international leaders in agricultural technologies. Argentina is too. And several countries are actually relatively good in biotechnology issues, associated to both, living organisms, but also, medical processes. So there can be lots of innovation. So in this big push in research and development that we're proposing in our consensus, lots of the new innovation, the new push can actually be in these areas in which Latin America is actually not far behind. I mean, of course, we are far behind in other areas in, let's say, in artificial intelligence, for example. But in these areas, we can actually be quite competitive, I think.
Very good. And just a quick final wrap up on that point. I think this hunt for the vaccine has demonstrated here, especially in Brazil, but I think in other Latin American countries, how strong biomedical research is. And in that area of technology, Latin America occupies an important place. And I think now with the pandemic, it even more integrated, Jose Antonio, into global networks of research in that field and in related biomedical fields. But thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I'm gonna let you catch your breath for 2 seconds. I'm going to encourage our people listening online, our friends online, who probably coloquem suas perguntas no Q&A. And I'll turn it over to our host, Luciana. Luciana, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you. We already received a lot of questions. I'm not sure we will have time to cover all of them. We still have around 15 minutes to go. So I will start with a question from Camila Gramkov from CEPAL Brazil office. She's asking, what are the main options for Latin America to fund a recovery program based on green sustainable investments? Do you believe countries should increase public debt in the short run? If not, how to open fiscal space? Who would like to start?
That seems a question for Rogério. Let's see, on the fiscal side, I think that is an international issue. I mean, how middle-income countries are supported to be able to manage a larger fiscal deficits and increased debt ratios during this crisis is a very important issue. By the way, in the UN processes that have been taking place this week, actually, on financing, one of the very interesting proposals was a proposal by the president of Costa Rica that was echoed by CEPAL quite a bit, which is basically a global fund of around $500 billion that would lend to middle-income and low-income countries for loans for 50 years, essentially zero or very low interest rate. Could be the interest rate of the treasury bonds of the US, for example. It's actually a very interesting proposal. I mean, there is no such a thing during this crisis as a strong support for middle-income countries. It's one of the big gaps, let's say, that you see in the whole. I mean, that's by the way, a topic in which I just published. I did a project for a paper for UNDP, and there is a version that was just published in the latest Revista La CEPAL, the CEPAL journal, exactly on how limited the international cooperation, financial cooperation has been during this crisis, actually compared to 2008, 2009, in which there was much more international financial cooperation.
Rogério, would you like to add some?
Yes, I would. First of all, I think I don't know Camila personally, but I think it's the same one that is one of the people responsible in CEPAL for one of the most interesting works done in terms of green recovery. It's called the Big Pushes, if I'm not wrong, and that has we have to look at that. So I'm very grateful that she's asking that question. Now. Yeah, the question how to finance it. I think that we have well, sometimes it's right. I mean, most of the countries are using expanding public debt in order to finance their investments. We have more restrictions. It will take a little while to explain why the restriction exists, but it's very difficult to see us expanding our public debt significantly. But we will have to do that. And if we do that, what really matters is how much that investment mobilize even more resources from the private sector. I think it is a mistake that prevails in the economic discourse in our region, that either you have more private sector or more state. In most of the case, what you need to do is to do smart public investments and increase the public debt as little as possible, but to use that to leverage more resources. And that requires aligning the public instruments like public development banks and other public banks, and putting together a comprehensive program, for instance, in sustainable infrastructure that can attract international direct investors, but also not international, direct investors and people to fund those projects. It can be done. I mean, what I would say is that, yes, the region has to use the little fiscal space it has, first to save lives and livelihoods, and the second one is to put the money where you can leverage more resources. And there's no other place that you can leverage more resources than I would submit than in sustainable infrastructure. I'll stop.
Thank you. Thank you, Rogério. Next question. Some green infrastructure projects need a pilot test, the size of benefit, needs a pilot to test the size of benefits before they can be presented to private investors. Can we mobilize multilateral investments to finance this sort of research and development for green infrastructure projects?
Should José Antonio?
No, Rogério, it's a question for you.
Well, I think we can, but I think we have to be realistic. I mean, the capacity of multilateral institutions, and José Antonio could talk about that. He would be my favorite World Bank president, as everybody knows. Everybody knows that history. But multilateral development institutions have not been a major sources of resources. They have been incremental. What they can bring a lot, and that capacity to finance Latin America is very small nowadays, but they can help make the bridge in order to leverage the resources, both domestically with blend financing, but also bringing capacity, and be the bridge in international markets to issue green bonds, to issue green securities, to bring green credit. So the role has got to be changed. You have to have an ecosystem of cooperation between national, regional, and multilateral institutions in order to get that. But we should not expect multilateral development institutions to fill a gap of the size that is needed.
I actually just one idea that just came to my mind. But there is actually this network of agricultural research centers that actually are coordinated by the World Bank, but it's a very important network of research centers financed internationally, which actually 3 of them are located in Latin America. You have CIMIT for corn and wheat in Mexico. CEB for potatoes in Peru, and CEAT for agricultural technology, for tropical agricultural technologies in Colombia. Something like that, I mean, this is network and actually perhaps enhance with new institutions, it could become a very interesting way of promoting new ways of, of doing research and development with a green focus. Even new institutions, or even this institution, for example, CEAT, the one in Colombia, has been moving into sustainable agriculture. And you could think of something like that, but in other areas, you could think of that. I mean, the big advantage of this network is when they do innovations, and they patent them, that patent is free for everyone to use. So they have free patents, and that's something that is going to be essential. I mean, to start with this, we should even adopt that for the vaccine for COVID-19 to start with. but actually, in 2001, there was that decision adopted in the WTO meeting in Doha in December of that year, which actually was one of the, let's say, the positive effects of the terrorist attack in the United States, actually. Because it allowed the U.S. to promote the idea of cases in which you have to have exceptions to intellectual property rights, and they were adopted for medical issues, actually, particularly for AIDS, and Brazil and India actually became big producers of medicines for AIDS. Thanks to that decision, and the same thing could happen. I mean, we have for example, in COVID-19 vaccines, we have a lot of capacity in Brazil, a lot of capacity in Mexico, in Argentina, partly in Colombia. That could be pharmaceutical industry that could respond very aggressively if we had access to the technology once the whatever appropriate vaccine. Which also has to do with this big debate on intellectual property rights that has been in the agenda for a long time. That in many cases, I mean, there are two solutions. One is the one of the Agricultural Research Center, is that you pay for the innovation to a public sector institution, and when the science and technology innovation is done, is for free access. But the other is actually for the state to buy the intellectual properties. I mean, a group of countries could actually buy the intellectual property if there is a successful vaccine, and then allow anyone to use that technology. I mean, that's another alternative that you can think of. I mean, many people, for example, that idea is very much in the hands of the ideas of Joe Stiglitz, my colleague here at Columbia University, that in many cases, what you have to have is, particularly when you have lots of public sector investments and support for science and technology, that the results of those science and technology have to have basically free access to that technology.
Can I just make a comment, because I think I did not respond to an important question about the pilot. And I agree completely with what Jose Antonio has just said. But this, I think it was Camila who asked, "Oh, well, you need pilots to prove to the international investors." I would submit that there are plenty of pilots already in existence in the region, in renewable energy, in urban mobility, in nature-based sanitation, biodiversity. My own institution, WRI, is a good source just to look at the examples of very successful projects in that relation. What you need is to scale up that. You don't need renewable, just one or two projects on renewable energies for cities, or linking that with urban mobility. You need to have pipelines. Once you have pipelines, and you can create the structures to present that to international investors and creditors. This is how it works. And it only works if somebody takes the sunk costs necessary to create those pipelines. BNDES, for instance, the National Development of Brazil, is doing that with what they call factory of projects. They should be doing more of that. By the way, BNDES has a very successful story in terms of finance, not only finance, but promoting sustainable projects in Brazil and making those projects bankable and using that to back assets that are going to be used. So that's just the compliment I want to for that question.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid we're approaching the end of our meeting today. So I'll leave you with one last question, and we will invite you to final remarks as well. What is the role of education and access of technology in the development of a green recovery for the region? How to develop projects to close the gaps in these sectors in the region? Who would like to start?
Well, Jose Antonio, my boss.
Rogério.
Okay, let me start that. I think that it goes the other way around, which is once you define the long-term vision for the region, then you think about the policies to adequate. I don't like to talk about education as just human capital, but that's something that is important because the new generations are the ones that are going to be filling the gaps in the labor market, and they have to be prepared according to a long-term vision. If you have a long-term vision that says we're going to use sustainability for access of education, then you have to introduce the education and the training necessary for that. And this is incredible because the young generations, the youth, are the ones most interested in this kind of innovations. And this is something that youth in the region need. They need to look at the future and say, oh, I'm going to have a good job producing solar farms. I'm going to have a good job producing better urban mobility. I'm going to be at the front edge of natural-based system. This is what is going to both drive the education system and drive the youth to innovation. That's what I think, is once you define where you want to go. I want to stress this. I mean, one of the problems of the region is that we have lost the narrative, the long-term vision that can align policies, but also people in the public and private sector towards that goal. And I think that's why a green recovery and a sustainable development can do.
Not much to add. I mean, I think I totally agree. Actually, one thing that is important, however, is much more education in sustainable development issues. When I was a student, that issue was absolutely not in the agenda of my courses. I mean, now, unfortunately, even my children have had a lot of training. I mean, a lot of courses in which the issue of sustainability is in the primary and secondary school, and there are many universities now producing new brands. And I would say in technical education, there has to be lots of additional training, which will allow workers to be retrained into this issue that Rogério was mentioning. So I think this is a good opportunity for the education system for sure.
Thank you. I would like to thank Professor Ocampo and Rogério for sharing with us such powerful ideas. I would like to thank Thomas for this excellent debate and partnership. Thomas, would you like to make your final remarks, please?
Just I add my thanks, and I'm just as we ended it too early, but maybe that's a good reason to end it. And I hope we can have both of you back in some iteration. I know, Rogério, you're a frequent guest and a member of CEBRI, but Jose Antonio, I think your comments are very useful as we here in Brazil look for solutions outside of a closed conversation which occurs here in Brazil. Brazil needs to look at what's happening around the world, but maybe particularly starting with what's happening in the neighbors. And so I want to thank you both for being with us tonight. It was great, and hope to see you as soon as the pandemic allows that. Boa noite.
Boa noite. Thank you very, very much. It was a pleasure and honor.
Muito
obrigado. Muito obrigado. Gracias a todos.
Thank you all, and thanks for the audience.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Ciao.